Hey everybody, my name is Alex Wiseman. We're going to be talking today about theory testing and theory building. This is something that we've been discussing in a couple of the classes that I'm teaching, and it's also, I think, an interesting topic all by itself. So let's give it a shot and see what we can find out. What we're going to do is we're going to go over a couple of different things in basically three sections. The first section, we're going to talk a little bit about what theory is. Specifically, we're talking about social science theory, and even more specifically, I'm going to be talking about, or at least thinking about, theory that is relevant to comparative and international education research. Then we're going to spend some time talking about theory testing, and we're going to spend some time talking about theory building. So that is the basic overview. Could not be more straightforward. I would like to point out that I'm going to be focusing on the information from two different sources. One is this Colquitt and Zapata-Phelan article from 2007. It's something that I have assigned for one of the classes that I'm teaching, the doctoral seminar, and I think it's a very good introduction to the idea of theory building and theory testing and how to look for that in the things that you're reading. The other thing that we're going to be taking a lot of information from today is this online textbook by Bhattacharjee, called Social Science Research Principle Methods and Practices. Specifically, there is a section on theory and theory building and theory testing. So I will be borrowing heavily and quoting extensively from these two sources. Please do assume that all of the information comes from them and that I'm just putting my own spin on it. So let's start out with the basics. What is a theory? Well, it's hard not to get a little distracted by the bold part down here. We could say, on the surface, or at least to begin with, theory should explain why things happen rather than just describe or predict. This why things happen is going to be very important. And if we want to, we can borrow a definition from Bacharach in 1989, who says theories are explanations of a natural or social behavior, event, or phenomenon. It's a way to explain a social phenomenon or an educational phenomenon or a comparative and international education phenomenon. And if we get more specific or more formal, we can say that a scientific theory is a system of constructs, which we can also call concepts, and propositions, which indicate the relationships between these constructs, that collectively presents a logical, systematic, and coherent explanation of the phenomenon of interest within some assumptions and boundary conditions. So I'm just going to underline a couple of the key things. We'll actually come back to these. These will end up being our four elements of a theory: constructs, propositions, logic, and boundary conditions. But if we were to remember simply that it's an explanation of a phenomenon, that would be good enough. Now let me pause for a second here and say what a theory is not. A theory does not equal, see, my handwriting's not so great on this, an ideology. Takes me a while to write, sorry. In other words, a theory is not a belief. It has to be somehow testable. And that is going to be the important part. It needs to be empirically testable. An ideology, you can just believe it. You don't need to have any data or evidence. You don't have to have anybody else who even believes it along with you. It can just be your belief, your idea, your ideology. What we're saying is that a theory is something that is much more bounded by data than that. If there isn't data that can be used to support it, or to confirm it, or to deny it, or to deconstruct it, then it isn't a theory. It's just an ideology. There are different scopes for theories. Sometimes we call this macro and micro. I actually like the specific terminology a little better. So ideographic, which we might call micro, and nomothetic, which we might call macro, are two ways of thinking about the scope of a theory. With ideographic theory explains a single situation or event in idiosyncratic detail. So if I want to be able to explain why I have a cold today, then I'm going to be able to collect all sorts of information about, well, I didn't take my vitamins, and I didn't eat very well last week, and I'm short on sleep, and I'm stressed about an upcoming project, and I shook hands with a guy who was all sneezy. I mean, you can find all this data about that specific event. But the problem with ideographic theory is that it's not very generalizable. That's why we have generalizability down here, because that is sometimes the key distinction between these two when we're talking about not just scope, but also what do we do with it. So ideographic theory can tell me everything I want to know. It can be very detailed, very specific, very valid about a situation. In other words, me having a cold. Whereas it wouldn't be able to be generalized to a larger group. In other words, I couldn't say that everybody in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where I'm sitting right now, has a cold because of the same conditions or as a result of the same combination of factors. That would not be something I could get from ideographic theory. A nomothetic theory, however, explains a class of situations or events rather than a specific situation or event. This means that it's going to be looking at what are the conditions in the broader context, if we're going to stick to the cold thing, that would cause multiple people in the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania area to have a cold during this time of the year. Maybe it has to do with the change in temperature that occurs annually. Maybe it has to do with the pollen in the air or other allergens. Maybe it has to do with the population percentage that has a cold or is contagious typically during this kind of year. I mean, there are other factors that we could look at. We could find empirical data on it. It would actually be quite generalizable because we could say, well, these are factors that apply to a broader context, a broader population, a much bigger sample. But it wouldn't be very specific or detailed. In other words, it might miss the exact combination of factors that gave me a cold versus somebody else a cold. So we have two ways of thinking about the scope of theory and then the what we can do with that theory, how we can frame it. One is ideographic and one is nomothetic. And we've got the idea that there's a distinction between a theory and an ideology. A theory is an explanation of a phenomenon. It's made up of constructs, propositions, logic, and boundary conditions, and it has to be empirically testable. An ideology could have those sorts of elements still to it, but it's not necessarily empirically testable, and it's not necessarily going to have all of these elements in it. All right, let's keep charging ahead. What are the benefits of theory? Well, there are a lot of good reasons why we would want to include theory, and I'm just going to pause for a moment here and suggest that it is really a theory that sets apart good research from great research. Without a theory, usually researchers don't really know what they're looking at. They don't have an explanation for what is happening. And that seems to be often the point of good research, is to not just be able to predict or estimate, because we can do that with data without having any theory. The point is to understand what the phenomenon is, what's actually happening. So the benefits of a theory. One, it provides an underlying logic for whatever the phenomena is. That helps us understand it from just a basic perspective. What is the underlying logic? Second, it aids in sense making through strategic synthesis of empirical data. Here we have the empirical data part, and we have the idea that we're trying to make sense of a phenomenon with the logic and with the data. Third, it identifies constructs and relationships that might be worthy of further research. So if you have a theory that is explaining why a particular phenomenon happens, it can also help you understand what are some of the constructs or factors, what are some of the relationships that are out there that are relevant for that particular phenomenon that might need to be investigated further. In other words, it provides a platform and a network for research rather than just being we have some data and we can see what happens with the data. And then fourth, it contributes to our cumulative knowledge by bridging gaps or causing a reevaluation of phenomenon. One of the cool things about theory is that it doesn't just stand alone. It builds on other work that's out there, other things that have been established and decided and understood about particular phenomena, so that we can now test those, or we can build new theories that will help us bridge gaps or reevaluate what we thought we knew. Very important stuff. There are limitations to theory, however. For one, they can provide very simplified explanations of reality, so they might not be the most adequate explanations of a phenomenon. One of the reasons for this is we try to create theories that rely on as few variables as possible, or few constructs as possible. The ones that, you'll see this when we talk about building and testing theory later, the theories that use the fewest number of constructs or variables tend to be the best, especially if they're accurate. Right? So anybody can make something complex, but the key is, can you find a very simple explanation? Problem being, may not be a completely adequate explanation. What that means is that since they're designed to be simple and parsimonious like that, in other words, focusing on just one or a particular element, they often are only taking a slice of reality, because we know that reality is a much more complex undertaking than simply looking at one or two factors. So that's a real limitation of theory. Reality is complex. Reality has a lot going on. In theory, we try to silo, or we try to take a slice of what's happening and explain that slice. And because we do that, this focused or limited range of vision can actually mean that we miss important concepts out of our particular theory scope. So for example, if we're working with an ideographic theory, then we're missing things that are happening at the macro level or across different situations. If we're taking a nomothetic approach, then we're missing the specific details that are occurring in unique situations and contexts all over the place within our broader macro scope. All right, so we have talked about what theory is. We have talked about some of the different kinds of theory. We talked about the benefits and the limitations of theory. Let's talk about the elements of theory, and then we will end this screencast and go on to the next one. 4 elements of theory that we should be aware of. One is constructs, which is the what of theories. What concepts are important for explaining a phenomenon? If we have a particular phenomenon in mind, it's the what are the things that are obvious to us about this. You have a cold, it's cold and flu season, there are particular characteristics of this, whatever. Another element of theory is propositions. This is the how of theory, so it shows how the concepts are related to each other. So if we have concept 1 and we have concept 2, the propositions show what this connector is. Right? So these are the relationships, a very important part. In fact, I would argue this is one of the most important parts. Third is logic, which is the why of theory. So why are these concepts related? So we've got concept 1, we've got concept 2, we've got how they're related. Now we need to explain why that how exists, why that happens the way that it does. So again, this is also one of the most important parts of theory. If it were up to me, I would say that these are the 2 elements of theory, but it's not up to me. And then fourth, we have boundary conditions or assumptions, which is the who, when, and where of theory. Basically tells us what the context is and under what circumstances will these concepts and relationships work. It's necessary because it also provides us with the scope. It helps us understand what we're doing and how we're doing it, who we're doing it, what the situation is like, so that we can think about how this might apply in other situations as well. Okay, we have just spent the last 15 minutes doing this, talking about in a very summary fashion what is theory, what are the benefits, what are the limitations, what are the elements. We're going to come back with 2 more screencasts looking at theory testing and theory building. See you shortly.